Hey everyone! So tonight we're diving into something we can all relate to, sleep, but specifically how people in the Middle Ages handled it. And trust me, it's way weirder than you'd think. Before you get too cozy, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button and subscribe, but honestly, only if you're actually vibing with what I'm doing here. Also, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always so cool to see how far our little community reaches. All right, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some white noise, and let's just ease into tonight's story together. Long before electricity, TikTok, or sleep influencers existed, people back then had a sleep schedule that would completely confuse anyone today. They called it segmented sleep. Basically, they split their night in half, kind of like breaking a stale medieval biscuit right down the middle. The routine was pretty straightforward. You'd head to bed right after the sun went down and fall into what they called your first sleep. Then, about 4 hours later, you just wake up on purpose. You'd spend the next hour or two doing some medieval midnight multitasking. Back then, this wasn't seen as insomnia, it was just how life worked. That gap between the two sleeps was actually super productive and surprisingly social. People would use the time to pray, read, fix the fire, or go check on their animals, because nothing ruins your deep sleep like worrying if your goat is still in the yard. And yeah, it was also considered the absolute best time for a little midnight intimacy with a partner. After all that, they'd drift back off into their second sleep until morning. Back in the day, doctors and marriage manuals actually pointed out that this midnight gap was when the body was most rested and the mind was calm. Which, let's be real, is just a polite way of saying you were too tired to pick a fight with anyone. So, if you ever thought you were being romantic by waking Massachusetts, was covered in more than just snow. Early to brew your partner some coffee. Just know that our ancestors were setting the bar on a whole different level. After that little break, they'd drift off into their second sleep until the sun came up. Everyone was doing it, from monks in monasteries to farmers in the fields. Even famous writers like Chaucer mentioned it casually in his work. So yeah, even in classic medieval literature, people were basically blogging about their weird sleep schedules. Interestingly, modern science suggests that this two-part cycle might actually be more natural for us. It turns out our circadian rhythms naturally lean this way when you take away artificial light. So, the next time you're wide awake at 2 a.m., don't panic. Just whisper to yourself, "Ah, yes, the watch has begun," and go check on a symbolic fireplace or something. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution, with its factories, gas lamps, and obsession with productivity, that we started forcing ourselves into this 8-hour straitshot, as if sleeping were some kind of timed sport. In the medieval world, waking up at night wasn't a fail, it was just the plan. Now let's talk about beds, or at least what they called beds back then. Today we're obsessed with thread counts, memory foam, and cooling gels. In medieval Europe, a bed was usually just a pile of things that used to be alive, now flattened by the weight of poor sleep and unspoken regrets. If you were a peasant, you slept on a pallet, which was basically just straw or hay stuffed into a rough sack. And that's if you were lucky enough to have a sack. If not, you were just sleeping on a pile of straw on the floor, which was probably damp and most likely already claimed by the family cat. These weren't comfortable, but they were better than the alternative, nothing. Straw was cheap and kept you warm, but it was also a 5-star hotel for lice, insects, and the occasional field mouse. Sleeping became an exercise in staying perfectly still. If it itched, you just had to ignore it. Çok özür dilerim. Bir anlık dalgınlıkla Türkçe devam etmişim. Hemen kaldığı yerden, o samimi ve bizden İngilizce tonuyla devam ediyoruz. If a bug bit you, you just shift a little and hope for the best. If a family had a bit of extra cash, or at least a back that still worked, they might lift that straw mattress onto a wooden frame. It didn't exactly turn it into a 5-star suite, but it did slightly lower the odds of waking up with a beetle in your ear. Sheets? Total luxury. Most people just crashed in the clothes they'd been wearing all day. Pajamas weren't a thing, and honestly, neither was personal space. Entire families, kids, parents, maybe a grandparent, all slept together in the same spot, sometimes on the very same pile of straw. If you got too hot, your only move was to roll over into your cousin's elbow. Now the nobles? They had the real deal. Massive wooden frames, feather mattresses, fancy embroidered sheets, and canopies to block out drafts and hopefully the lice. These beds were so valuable they were literally passed down in wills. You didn't inherit a plot of land. You inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. Still, for most folks, a bed wasn't about comfort. It was just a place to not freeze to death. Stay away from the chickens, and maybe, just maybe, dream of being rich enough to sleep on something that didn't squawk or rustle. Today, when we hear nightcap, we think of a cozy little drink, maybe a whiskey by the fire, and a questionable decision. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a drink. It was a hat, a real, tangible, and usually pretty ridiculous-looking piece of fabric designed to keep your head from freezing off while you slept. See, insulation wasn't exactly a priority in medieval architecture. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made of thin animal horn didn't do much against the cold. And back then, central heating was just the family dog. Since body heat escapes fastest through your head, people turned to the humble nightcap. These hats came in all shapes, but the most iconic one was long and pointed, like something a wizard would wear if he had a side hustle as a chimney sweep. They were usually made of wool or linen. For men, it was practical. For women, it often doubled as a head wrap to keep things modest and cover up hair that hadn't seen soap since last Lent. But it was also a status symbol. Nothing says, "I've made it," like going to bed with a tiny flag on your skull. In the city, wearing one was basically the medieval version of do not disturb. If you answered the door in your nightcap, it was a polite way of saying, "I am not in the mood for a chat. Go away." These were usually paired with nightshirts. Think Ebenezer Scrooge, but without the ghosts. It wasn't sexy, it was itchy, and occasionally it was flammable. Fast forward to travel. Today, sleeping next to a stranger is usually reserved for long flights or a weird Airbnb mix-up. In medieval Europe, it was totally normal and definitely not optional. Say you're a merchant or a pilgrim whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. You find an inn, a luxury in itself, and ask for a bed. What you get isn't a private room. It's not even a clean floor. What you actually got was a spot in a bed that was already occupied. Medieval inns were basically human bunkhouses, nothing like the hotels we know today. Privacy? Forget about it. If there was a gap in the bed, you were filling it, usually next to complete strangers who might snore like a freight train, talk in their sleep, or have a suspicious number of boils. And the crazy part? This wasn't even considered rude. It was just efficient. One bed could host 2, 3, or even 4 travelers, depending on how much they could tolerate each other. In bigger cities, you'd end up in a massive hall with rows of beds and zero personal space. Snoring contests were basically a nightly event, and elbow territory was a serious battleground. Sometimes they'd try to group people by job, blacksmiths with blacksmiths, priests with priests, and allegedly thieves with other thieves, but usually it was just first come, first sprawled. Now, if you're a germaphobe, this sounds like a literal nightmare. But back then, it was a massive upgrade from sleeping outside with the wolves, the rain, and the occasional peasant uprising. Worried about getting robbed. Most travelers slept with their coin purse tied to their belt or hidden deep in their clothes. Others used their luggage as a pillow, the ultimate low-tech alarm system. If someone moved your bag, you'd wake up immediately, hopefully before you woke up poorer. Of course, the rich didn't deal with any of this. Nobles traveled with their own crew and stayed in relative comfort, demanding private rooms unless the innkeeper wanted his roof burned down. But here's the real kicker. In the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket. It was a spiritual operation, a nightly gamble where the stakes were your eternal soul. People didn't just sleep, they prepared to potentially die. Forget lavender pillow sprays or sleep stories on a meditation app. Medieval sleepers wound down with confessions, psalms, and soul-cleansing prayers, just in case they didn't make it to sunrise. The logic was simple. You could die at any moment from illness, fire, demons, or, the most dangerous thing of all, being over 30 in the year 1247. You said your prayers not because they were soothing, but because hell was terrifying, and you didn't want to show up there uninvited and spiritually messy. You know that rhyme, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." We think it's sweet now, but it's basically a legal contract written by a 7-year-old acknowledging that death is a very likely bedtime outcome. Adults had a whole catalog of these. One for guilt, one for when you thought a demon was hiding in the roof, and one for plague prevention, which, spoiler alert, didn't work great. Some even prayed to specific saints who acted like holy bouncers guarding your soul while you slept. The super devout, monks, nuns, and very anxious nobles ended their day with Compline, the final prayer service before bed. After Compline, everyone took a vow of silence, which, honestly, wasn't that hard considering everyone was exhausted, hungry, and low-key terrified of the dark. Kids were encouraged to pray too, partly for their souls, and partly because it was the only way to get them to stop asking why the dog was hogging the bed again. Parents would tell them that angels were watching over them, which sounds sweet until you realize it was less guardian angel and more like a celestial surveillance system. Basically, pre-sleep prayer was less about finding inner peace and more about last-minute damage control. Think of it as medieval antivirus software. You just hoped it worked, even if you had no clue how it actually functioned. In our world, we usually brush off dreams as random brain noise, too much stress, or maybe just that late-night pizza. But in the Middle Ages, dreams were serious business, like eternal consequences serious. They weren't just dreams, they were seen as direct DMs from God, saints, the devil, or your guardian angel. Some were divine revelations, others were demonic traps. Either way, you had to pay attention. You might need to write it down, confess it, or fast for 3 days just to be safe. Theologians and monks spent a crazy amount of time trying to decode this stuff. If you dreamt of fire, might be a heads up about hell. Dreamt of water, could be purification, or you're about to drown. Dreamt of a guy with a goat's head juggling fish? Yeah, call a priest immediately and maybe pack your bags. People believed your soul stayed active while you slept, so your actions in a dream could actually reveal your hidden sins. That embarrassing dream about stealing a loaf of bread? That was your subconscious snitching on your real-world greed. Better confess it just in case. Monks and nuns even shared their dreams with their bosses. Some were praised for their holy visions, while others were just told to stop eating so many onions before bed. Dreams were basically the Netflix of the medieval world, full of knights, angels, and demons, just with way more metaphors and way fewer happy endings. Of course, the church was suspicious. They worried some dreams were planted by demons to mess with you. If you had a not-so-holy dream, it meant your soul was under attack. Or maybe you just inhaled too many fumes from the fireplace. And speaking of beds, while some of us let our pets sleep with us today because it's cute back then, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a personality trait. It was a survival strategy for warmth. Let's look at how that worked. Medieval homes weren't exactly built for comfort. We're talking stone walls, zero insulation, and drafts so aggressive they probably had names. Back then, central heating was just the family pig. In peasant homes, it was totally normal for humans and livestock to crash in the same room, sometimes even the same bed or straw pile. Chickens would wander around, dogs curled up at your feet, and pigs snorted softly by the fire. And if you were lucky, none of them decided to take a nibble out of you during the night. This wasn't because they were obsessed with their pets. It was pure survival. Animals generated body heat. They were warm, dependable, and unlike some relatives, they didn't hog the blankets. A big dog could keep your toes from freezing, and a cow in the corner could raise the room temperature by a degree or two, which in the middle of January felt like a literal miracle. In these one-room houses, everyone, humans and animals alike, just made it work. You'd have kids nestled between their parents and a goat, with a chicken serving as a high-stakes alarm clock. As for the hygiene, let's just not go there. Wealthy families, of course, thought they were too good for this. Nobles didn't sleep with cows, though they did keep lapdogs in bed, not for the heat, but for fashion and to redistribute the fleas. Some castles even had separate rooms for their favorite animals, because nothing says "I'm rich" like a dog with its own title and bedroom. Sure, there were downsides. Animals are loud, they wander, and they've never been big on personal space. Getting a hoof to the face at 3 a.m. was just part of the routine. If you've ever stayed in a youth hostel and thought, "This is a bit much," let me introduce you to the medieval monastic dormitory, the place where comfort went to die quietly under a vow of silence. Monasteries didn't believe in soft things or, well, fun. Dozens of monks slept in one giant room, lined up like morally upright sardines. Beds were basically wooden planks. You slept fully clothed, not just for modesty, but because trying to get dressed in the dark at 2 a.m. for prayers was a nightmare. Your robe and sandals were your spiritual armor and your only insulation. No pillows, no curtains, and absolutely no talking. Silence wasn't a suggestion, it was the law. If you groaned too loudly while rolling over, you might end up on chamber pot duty for a week. Snoring was a gray area. You couldn't help it, but your cellmates, and maybe the Lord, definitely judged you for it. The goal wasn't to rest. It was to not sin. Some monks even slept sitting up just to make sure they didn't enjoy it too much. Compared to that, a pile of straw and a snoring pig actually sounds like a luxury suite. At least the pig didn't judge your soul. Now let's talk about something that would haunt any modern sleeper, waking up at 2 a.m. on purpose. Not for a snack or to scroll through your phone, but for loud, cold, candle-lit prayer. In medieval monasteries, this was just the standard routine. Monks and nuns lived by a super strict schedule called canonical hours, which kicked off with matins. And when I say daybreak, I actually mean the absolute darkest part of the night, the time when even the owls are still figuring out if they want to get up. A bell would toll, usually rung by whichever poor soul drew the short straw, and a whole dormitory of sleep-deprived people in robes would shuffle toward the chapel in total silence. And yep, still in their full-day clothes, because monks didn't do pajamas. Their only layering system was purely spiritual. Inside the chapel, with only flickering candles and echoes for company, they'd chant psalms and recite scriptures while trying their absolute hardest not to fall asleep standing up. Which, by the way, was a massive struggle. There are actual records of monks getting punished for nodding off mid-prayer, usually with more chores or even more prayers. It was basically, "Oh, you fell asleep during matins? Congrats, now you get to lead the next one." Matins could last an hour, or even 2 if the order was feeling extra intense. Imagine trying to stay spiritually engaged when your stomach is reminding you that dinner was just a bowl of lentils and a lecture on morality, and your body is literally shutting down. After the service, they'd either crawl back for their second sleep or, if it was a stricter place, head straight to manual labor. Because nothing says holy discipline like threshing wheat on 4 hours of broken sleep. Why do it? To sacrifice comfort and give the quietest part of the night to God. It was a powerful symbol, once you got past the numb feet, the candle smoke, and Brother Ambrose chanting off-key. Fast forward to today, sleeping alone is seen as a luxury, peace, quiet, and total control over the blankets. But in the medieval world, sleeping alone was suspicious, impractical, and honestly felt unsafe. First off, warmth. As we know, stone walls and drafty chimneys didn't trap heat, and central heating was still several plagues away. People shared beds for body heat, not for romance, but out of sheer thermal desperation. Kids slept with siblings, parents, and sometimes even the neighbor's kid. It was like a giant sleepover that nobody actually signed up for. But beyond the cold, there was a spiritual reason for the cuddle puddle. People genuinely believed the devil worked overtime at night. Alone in the dark, your soul was considered vulnerable to temptation or even possession. Having people nearby was like a moral buffer zone. If something went wrong, at least there was a witness. For kids, being alone at night was unthinkable. Not just for comfort, but because ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits were treated as real parts of the landscape. Bedtime stories back then didn't end with a hug and a glass of water. They were warnings that sleeping alone was a gateway to spiritual disaster. Sweet dreams, right? Those stories didn't end with a warm glass of milk. They ended with people disappearing. Even married couples didn't get a break. They'd often share their bed with kids, servants, or even random guests. Back then, privacy wasn't a thing. It was basically a myth. In fact, the idea of just two people in a giant bed would have seemed either like a total waste of space or just straight up suspicious. Even in monasteries, monks slept in groups. If you were assigned to sleep alone, it was usually a punishment. Medieval logic was simple. Sleeping alone gives you a chance to sin. Sleeping in a group gives you public accountability. So, next time you're curled up in your own bed, with your own blanket, in a room that doesn't smell like a goat, just enjoy the silence. In medieval times, you'd probably have 2 kids, a sheepdog, and a cousin in there with you, all snoring in unison. And here's another weird one. Have you ever accidentally fallen asleep sitting up during a lecture or at the dentist? You usually wake up with a massive cramp in your neck and a lot of regret. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping upright wasn't an accident. It was a lifestyle choice. Some people, mostly the wealthy or the super religious, actually chose to sleep propped up rather than lying flat. Why? Well, for a few reasons, none of which sound restful. First, there was this medical belief that lying flat was bad for your digestion or your lungs. In a world where doctors thought a sneeze could literally rearrange your soul, this actually made sense to them. They thought sleeping upright prevented brain congestion, which sounds terrifying but mostly meant don't choke on your own phlegm. Second, there was the spiritual side. Lying flat was seen as being too close to the posture of the dead. You didn't want to confuse God, or worse, attract the angel of death, by sleeping in the same position they used for funerals. Superstitious? Definitely. But when your local priest is also your health consultant, you pick your battles. As a result, people would sleep partially reclined, propped up by big pillows or wooden headboards that were basically the medieval version of a lazy boy recliner. Nobles even had their beds rigged with angled supports, perfect for digesting a heavy meat pie or fending off a surprise demon attack. Monks took it to the extreme. In some orders, they'd sleep sitting upright on a bench or leaning against a cold stone wall. It wasn't for health, it was for discipline. If you were too comfortable, you might dream. If you dreamed, you might sin. And if you sinned, well, enjoy your 5 a.m. confession. Needless to say, none of this was about getting quality rest. It was all about virtue, being uncomfortable, and some pretty confusing theology, and forget about ghosts or goblins under the bed. For medieval folks, the real monsters were already inside the sheets. They were small, persistent, and didn't care one bit about your prayers. We're talking about fleas, lice, and the unofficial mascot of the medieval bedroom, the bedbug. Let's not sugarcoat it. Hygiene wasn't exactly Europe's strong suit back then. Baths were rare, laundry was pricey, and soap was made of, well, things we shouldn't even name. Add in straw mattresses, shared blankets, and a random chicken wandering around, and you've got the perfect all-you-can-eat buffet for pests. Fleas and lice were so common they were basically your roommates. Even the nobles with their fancy satin sheets weren't safe. In fact, some rich families had actual servants whose entire job title was nitpicker, literally picking lice out of their boss's hair. Imagine that on a resume. Bedbugs, meanwhile, were like the silent assassins of sleep. They'd hide in the wooden frames or the cracks in the walls and come out at night like tiny vampires. If you ever wondered why they wore those nightcaps and slept fully clothed, it wasn't just for the cold. It was basically pest defense armor. People tried everything to stop them, from the mildly helpful to the completely insane. Some burned strong-smelling herbs, while others slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes in the bed. It probably didn't stop the bugs, but it definitely kept the romance to a minimum. And if that wasn't enough, imagine trying to sleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron. Now, obviously, even knights didn't sleep in full armor every night. It was hot, heavy, and loud. Trying to roll over in chainmail is like trying to nap inside a bag of cutlery. But during a war or in a dangerous area, sleeping partially armored was the safe move. Survival comfort. A knight on a campaign might only take off his helmet, keeping his breastplate on just in case the enemy decided to throw a midnight surprise party. There's nothing quite like waking up to the sound of charging horses and having to get ready while you're still half dreaming about turnips. In castles under siege, soldiers slept with swords or axes by their side like aggressive security blankets, using their shields as pillows. Of course, sleeping in armor wasn't exactly restful. Iron doesn't breathe, and chainmail has a nasty habit of pinching your skin. Between the cold stone floors and the sound of your comrades snoring, it was basically a sleep environment that ranks somewhere below an airport terminal on the comfort scale. Traveling merchants or guards on watch duty might grab a nap in gambesons, basically thick, quilted jackets that offered some protection and a bit more padding than just the moral support of a prayer. And let's be honest, armor wasn't exactly subtle. If you rolled over the wrong way, you'd clank so loudly the whole camp would wake up thinking the apocalypse had arrived. Again, in a world where nightly demons, lice, and pigs in your bed were totally normal, you'd think sleepwalking would be just another minor inconvenience. But oh no, it was much more dramatic than that. In the Middle Ages, if you started wandering around in your sleep, people didn't blame it on stress or exhaustion. They assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had some unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. Noctambulation, as the local monks called it, was poorly understood and honestly feared. The idea that someone could rise from their straw pile, shuffle across the room, and stare blankly at a wall wasn't seen as a harmless sleep disorder. It was seen as the devil's rehearsal dinner. Picture this: a guy in a long nightshirt, candle in hand, eyes glazed over, mumbling Latin he doesn't even know while stepping over livestock. You'd think, ghost, heretic, or both. Depending on your local priest, an exorcism might be scheduled before breakfast. Some thought it was caused by black bile, the medieval catch-all for anything they couldn't explain, while others thought the soul was temporarily leaving the body to bumble around like an unattended mule. To prevent these nightly adventures, people tried everything: herbal remedies, iron charms, or, in the more practical rural areas, just tying the person's leg to a chair. And honestly, with open fires and knives lying around, it was probably for the best. There were even rumors of people climbing onto rooftops in their sleep. Whether those accounts were exaggerated or not, The fear was real enough that people barred their windows. If medieval life taught people anything, it was how to sleep through absolute chaos. Church bells, thunderstorms, screaming animals, even the occasional siege, these were just the medieval version of white noise. The church bells were the worst. They marked every single moment: sunrise, prayers, meals, and that ungodly 2 a.m. service. If you lived near a monastery, your dreams had a constant soundtrack of tolling bells. Eventually, the brain just accepted it. Bells became the lullaby of an overscheduled soul. Then you had the storms. With no weather apps or double-glazed windows, every clap of thunder felt like the end of the world. Roofs leaked, chimneys howled like banshees, but people still slept. They had to. Work didn't stop for insomnia, and neither did plowing the fields or running from Vikings. It's wild to think about, but in the 14th century, people somehow kept sleeping through famine, war, and even the Black Death. When the death carts rolled by in the morning, it was treated more like a grim wake-up call than a reason to panic. Honestly, if you didn't wake up at all, some people figured that was just a mercy. There are even records of people sleeping straight through earthquakes, barn fires, and angry mobs. Sleep deprivation was just part of the deal, and bodies adjusted. When you're working from sunrise to sunset, barely eating enough to stay alive, and spending your entire day dodging mud, taxes, and eternal damnation, you're going to crash hard. Some people even use sleep as an escape hatch. Faced with illness, grief, or the fear that the world was literally ending, which seemed to be predicted every other century, they'd just curl up under a cloak, mumble a prayer, and take a nap. There's actually a strange kind of wisdom in that. In the winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts was covered in more than just snow. There was this heavy tension and a quiet kind of fear that seeped into every timber-framed home and frozen field. The people in Salem were Puritans, strict, devout, and deeply superstitious. They truly believed they were building a holy city on a hill in the middle of a wilderness, watched by God and stalked by Satan. Life was already a struggle. The village had just split from Salem town over politics and religion, crops were failing, and smallpox had been tearing through nearby communities. On top of that, wars with native tribes had left a lot of people traumatized. Neighbors were constantly fighting over inheritance or politics, and there was a deep resentment toward anyone who didn't quite fit in. Add a long, bitter New England winter to that mix, and something was bound to break. That breaking point happened in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, started acting strange. They'd scream uncontrollably, throw things, and contort their bodies in ways that didn't seem human. Other times, they'd just go silent for hours, eyes wide with terror. The neighbors started whispering about curses. The girls claimed they were being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Reverend Parris, having no idea what to do, called in the local doctor, William Griggs. After failing to find any physical explanation, Griggs delivered the diagnosis that would plunge the village into total chaos: witchcraft. That one word set fire to the fears already simmering in Salem. In a place where people believed witches were real, dangerous servants of the devil, the idea wasn't far-fetched at all. And if the devil could worm his way into the minister's own house, what did that mean for everyone else? Prodded by adults and their peers, the girls started naming names. At first they went after people on the margins, social outcasts and misfits. But soon the accusations would reach the respectable, the wealthy, and even the most pious. Salem was just a small village, but what was about to happen would echo far beyond its borders. What started as whispers in the dark quickly turned into screams from the gallows, leaving a legacy of paranoia that still haunts American history books. Once the idea of witchcraft took root in Salem, it spread like ivy, quiet at first, then slowly strangling everything it touched. The afflicted girls, Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like Ann Putnam Jr., seemed to get bolder every day. They'd have convulsions in court, scream during prayers, and claim they could see dark spirits hovering over the village. It wasn't just childhood imagination anymore. It was a public, theatrical performance. And the most disturbing part was that everyone believed them. The first people they targeted were the ones with the least protection. Women already living on the fringes of society. You had Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who had a habit of muttering to herself when people turned her away from their doors. Naturally, everyone claimed her mumbling was a curse. She smoked a pipe, she snapped at kids, she fit the witch mold perfectly because she didn't fit the Puritan woman mold. Then there was Sarah Osborne, who hadn't been to church in over a year and had scandalized everyone by marrying her servant. She defied convention, which in their eyes made her an automatic suspect. But the most exotic target was Tituba, the enslaved woman in the Paris household. Coming from Barbados, her stories and folklore terrified the villagers. Under massive pressure and likely physical beatings, Tituba finally confessed. But instead of calming things down, her confession blew the whole thing wide open. She told stories about a tall man in black, the devil, asking her to sign a book, and spoke of yellow birds, red cats, and spectral dogs. Most damning of all? She claimed there were other witches in Salem. That was all the court needed to hear. Once Tituba opened that door, everyone else rushed through it. New names were added every week. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and old grudges were suddenly disguised as righteous accusations. If your cow died suddenly, or your baby cried during a prayer, it wasn't bad luck, it was the devil. The fear was so contagious that nobody dared to speak up. Defending an accused witch was basically an invitation to be accused yourself. Silence was the only safety. Logic was out the window, and hysteria was in the driver's seat. As the village reached a fever pitch, the colonial government stepped in. Governor William Phips set up a special court to handle the chaos, called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which is French for to hear and determine. In reality, it was just a factory for fear-driven justice. This wasn't an ordinary tribunal. The rules were completely warped by panic. Instead of needing actual evidence, they allowed spectral evidence. This was basically testimony that your spirit or specter had attacked someone. In other words, if someone claimed they saw your ghost choking them in a dream, that was admissible in court. It didn't matter if you were at church or miles away at the time. It was your spirit doing the devil's work. How do you cross-examine a dream? You can't. Suddenly, children were being treated as star witnesses. Their seizures and screams in court became more theatrical by the day. One girl, Mary Walcott, would fall into fits the second a suspect walked into the room. If a prisoner looked at her, she'd shriek. If they didn't look at her, she'd shriek even louder. The performances were mesmerizing, and the judges, including the influential Samuel Sewall and Chief Justice William Stoughton, soaked it all up. As for defense lawyers, there weren't any. The concept just didn't exist in colonial trials. If you were accused, you stood alone. If you denied the charges, the afflicted girls would writhe in agony right in front of you. If you confessed, you might be spared from the gallows, but only if you named other people. Basically, the system rewarded lies and punished silence. To make things worse, the trials became public spectacles. People traveled from all over to watch. The accused were paraded into court in shackles, usually bewildered, poor, and almost always powerless. Still, not everyone was buying it. Some townsfolk whispered that the girls were faking, while others wondered why only certain types of people were being targeted. But few spoke up. Questioning the court was seen as questioning the will of God. In Salem, logic had left the building, and the law had become a mirror reflecting fear, not justice. On June 10th, 1692, the gallows claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She was no stranger to scandal, which made her an easy target. She wore bright red clothing, ran a tavern, and had been accused of witchcraft years before. During her trial, neighbors testified that her spirit pinched them in their sleep, that their babies died after she passed by, and that she kept enchanted dolls. She denied everything, but the court found her guilty anyway. She was led to Gallows Hill, a barren, windswept spot just outside Salem. No prayer, no mercy. The rope was pulled, the crowd watched, and just like that, the machinery of death started churning. The hangings that followed came fast. On July 19th, 5 more women were executed. Some were actually in good standing with the church. Rebecca Nurse, in particular, was a shocking case, an elderly, pious woman beloved by everyone. Even the jury initially found her not guilty. But under pressure from the court and the girls, the verdict was reversed. Her final words were whispered like a warning. "I am as innocent as the child unborn." But it didn't matter. The noose didn't discriminate. By August, the executions kept coming. September 22nd was the deadliest day of all, with 8 people hanged in a single morning. Among them was Martha Corey, who had doubted the trials from the start. Her husband, Giles Corey, met a different, even more brutal fate. He refused to enter a plea. Since the court couldn't proceed without one, they used an ancient punishment. They pressed him to death. They piled stones on his chest, slowly and cruelly, over 3 days. Legend says his final words were simply, "More weight." By the time the hysteria finally cooled down, 19 people had been hanged, 1 had been pressed to death, and at least 5 more had died in jail. Dozens of people had confessed to lies just to save their own lives. Over 200 people were accused in total. The gallows didn't just cast a shadow over that hill, it cast a shadow over every heart in Salem. Fear had become the law, and justice, blindfolded, had been led straight to the scaffold. While the executions got all the attention, hundreds of others were rotting in cramped, foul-smelling jails, just waiting for a verdict or a miracle. Salem's tiny jail couldn't even hold them all. People were being chained to walls in neighboring towns like Ipswich and Boston, starving, freezing, and basically forgotten. Most of these people weren't outcasts. They were neighbors, friends, and parents, whose only crime was having an argument with the wrong person or owning land that someone else wanted. It's wild how many personal grudges were disguised as divine justice. A pig wanders into a neighbor's yard and dies. Must be witchcraft. Someone refuses to help you with firewood. Clearly they cursed your ex. Take Mary Easty, for example. She was the sister of Rebecca Nurse and a respected mother of 7. The court actually released her at first, but she was rearrested just days later after the girls had another round of fits. In her final petition, she didn't even beg for her own life. She begged the judges to stop the trials before more innocent blood was shed. She was hanged shortly after. Then there's the heartbreaking case of Dorothy Good, Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter. After her mom was arrested, this poor kid was interrogated and, under pressure, confessed to being a witch. Her terrified gibberish was taken as absolute truth. She was kept in chains in prison for 8 months. By the time she was released, she was mentally broken and never truly recovered from the trauma. Even pregnant women weren't spared. Elizabeth Proctor was sentenced to die, but because she was pregnant, they delayed her execution. That delay actually saved her life. She gave birth in jail and was eventually released once the madness ended. Accusations just kept snowballing. People confessed in total desperation to avoid death, then named others to shift the target off themselves. Entire families were dragged into the spiral. Fathers, wives, daughters. No one was safe. Meanwhile, the jails were overflowing, food was scarce, and disease was everywhere. It didn't matter who you were anymore. It only mattered who was willing to say your name. By the fall of 1692, the spell of hysteria finally started to crack. Not because the court suddenly became logical, but because reality forced its way back in. The turning point came when the accusations got too bold. Even people who had supported the trials suddenly found themselves looking at the gallows. Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister, was arrested and called the ringleader of the witches. He was well educated and had previously clashed with some powerful families, which was apparently enough to seal his fate. But on the day he was supposed to hang, he did something that shocked everyone. He stood on the gallows and perfectly recited the Lord's Prayer, something witches were supposedly unable to do. The crowd went dead silent. Some people even started crying. Even the most hardened observers were shaken, but the execution went ahead anyway. That prayer on the gallows planted a serious seed of doubt. But the real game changer was when they went after Mary Phipps, the governor's wife. Suddenly, the hysteria had climbed all the way to the top of the social ladder. Governor Phipps, who was already getting nervous about the growing chaos and criticism, finally stepped in. In October 1692, he shut down the Court of Oyer and Terminer, putting a dead stop to all trials and executions. The mood in town completely shifted. Ministers who had stayed quiet or even encouraged the madness finally started speaking out. Increase Mather, one of the most respected theologians around, officially denounced the use of spectral evidence. He famously said it was better for 10 suspected witches to go free than for one innocent person to be condemned. That was a radical idea in a society that, for months, had believed the exact opposite. People who had once cheered for the executions were now second-guessing everything. The jails were still packed, but the appetite for more blood had just faded. Too many respected people were being accused, and too many innocent people were already in the ground. The villagers finally started to see that this wasn't divine justice. It was just madness. Confessions dried up. Some of the accusers started backtracking, and the ones who had shouted the loudest suddenly couldn't look anyone in the eye. The fear hadn't exactly disappeared, but it had exhausted itself. Everyone just wanted stability, officials wanted to save face, and Salem, bruised and ashamed, was finally waking up from its nightmare. The storm was breaking, but the damage was already done. By late 1692, the judicial system that fueled the hysteria started collapsing under the weight of its own absurdity. When the special court was disbanded, a new, much more cautious one was formed in early 1693. This time, things were actually different. Spectral evidence was banned, and the judges were way more skeptical of the girls' wild stories. The result? Convictions slowed down dramatically. Most of the people brought to trial were just acquitted and sent home. Out of 56 cases, the vast majority were released. Even the people who had confessed started taking it back, admitting they only lied because of fear, torture, or pressure. The performances from the afflicted girls just didn't work anymore. One of the biggest turning points in unraveling the whole mess was when a high-ranking minister like Samuel Willard came under suspicion. He was never formally charged, but the fact that someone so devout could even be accused showed everyone just how corrupt and random the process had become. The court, which had once been ferocious, was now walking on eggshells. That prayer on the gallows really planted a seed of doubt in everyone's mind. But the real turning point, that was the accusation of Mary Phipps, the governor's wife. Suddenly, the hysteria had climbed all the way to the top of the social ladder. Governor Phipps, who was already feeling the pressure from all the chaos, finally stepped in. In October 1692, he shut down the Court of Oyer and Terminer, putting a total halt to all trials and executions. The whole mood in the colony shifted. Ministers who had been silent or even part of the problem started speaking up. Increase Mather, a huge name in theology back then, finally denounced spectral evidence. He famously said it was better for 10 suspected witches to escape than for one innocent person to be condemned. That was a radical shift for a society that had spent months believing the exact opposite. People who used to cheer at the trials were now second-guessing everything. The jails were still full, but the appetite for blood was gone. Too many respected people were being accused, and too many innocent lives were already lost. The villagers finally saw that this wasn't divine justice. It was just madness. Confessions dried up, accusers started to backtrack, and those who had shouted the loudest couldn't even look people in the eye anymore. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had exhausted itself. Everyone just wanted stability, and Salem, bruised and ashamed, was finally waking up from the nightmare. By late 1692, the system that fueled the hysteria collapsed under its own absurdity. When the new court formed in early 1693, things were actually different. Spectral evidence was banned, and judges were way more skeptical of the girls' wild claims. As a result, convictions dropped off a cliff. Most of the accused were acquitted. Out of 56 cases, the majority were simply released. Even those who had confessed started taking it back, admitting they only lied because of fear or torture. The performances from the afflicted girls just didn't have that power anymore. A major moment in the downfall was when a high-ranking minister like Samuel Willard was suspected. Even though he wasn't charged, the fact that someone so devout could be a target showed everyone how corrupt the whole process had become. The court, once so aggressive, was now walking on eggshells. The families of the victims eventually started demanding some kind of justice. Over the years, petitions flooded the government, asking for official pardons, for their property back, and for a public admission that their loved ones were innocent. Slowly, the government actually listened. In 1711, a bill was passed to restore the good names of some victims and offer some money to their heirs. But even then, it wasn't perfect. Families like the Coreys and Proctors were totally left out. In Salem, that shame became part of the town's DNA. The village even changed its name to Danvers, probably trying to outrun its own history. Gallows Hill was never officially marked, almost like the town was trying to bury the memory along with the dead. But you can't just bury something like that. It lived on in sermons and the awkward silence between former friends. Salem wasn't cursed by witches. It was cursed by fear, pride, and power that nobody kept in check. It's been over 3 centuries, but the legacy of the Salem trials still echoes today. It's not just a history lesson. It's a reminder of how fragile the truth really is. What happened in 1692 wasn't just a weird episode of mass hysteria. It was a total breakdown of logic and compassion. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers, turned into executioners just because they believed too easily and questioned too little. The courts that were supposed to protect people became tools for oppression. Religion was used as a weapon, testimony became a theater performance, and staying silent was seen as being guilty. One of the scariest things about Salem is how fast it all happened. In just a few months, fear completely won over facts. You didn't need actual demons. You just needed people to believe in them. But those trials also taught us some hard lessons. Centuries later, the Salem episode would be brought up in debates about civil liberties. When the U.S. Constitution was written, it included protections that were specifically designed to prevent the kind of nightmare that happened in Salem. Things like the right to a lawyer, the right to face your accusers, and the need for solid evidence. Those principles were forged from the ashes of Gallows Hill. Today, people throw around the phrase witch hunt for almost anything, often forgetting the real terror those words actually mean. Salem wasn't a metaphor. It was a real town where real people were hanged for imaginary crimes because the systems meant to protect them betrayed them. Maybe the biggest lesson is that unchecked fear is its own kind of tyranny. When fear is backed by power, by courts, churches, or governments, it becomes almost unstoppable. Salem is a warning that still stands today. Truth is fragile, and reason can fall the moment we let fear take the wheel. Justice isn't something that just happens automatically. History has this annoying habit of repeating itself unless we actually pay attention. Take Fulvia, for example. She was born around 83 BCE into the Fulvi family, a group that was elite but honestly a bit eccentric. They were an old family that had clawed their way into the top tier of Roman politics, producing generals and orators along the way. Her dad, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, wasn't exactly a legend. His nickname actually came from his stutter. But Fulvia? She didn't stutter. She was born to give orders. Growing up, she was surrounded by the sharpest minds in Rome. In her house, senators and generals didn't just chat. They debated the future of the world. Treachery and elections were just the daily news. She saw firsthand that power wasn't just won in the public forum. It was won through marriages, backroom deals, and even funerals. Now, Roman society expected women to be quiet, refined, and obedient. Fulvia was having none of that. She was wealthy, highly educated, and she knew exactly how to use her connections. She came of age during a time of total chaos. The Republic was falling apart, with guys like Caesar and Pompey turning Rome into a pressure cooker. But instead of hiding from the mess, Fulvia learned how to master it. She didn't see politics as a man's world to be feared. She saw it as a battlefield. She eventually married 3 of the most radical men in Rome, but she wasn't just a wife. She commanded armies, led revolts, and became the first Roman woman to be put on a coin as herself, not a goddess. Rome definitely wasn't ready for her. Her first marriage was to Clodius Pulcher, and calling it unconventional is an understatement. Clodius was a political arsonist. He was a hero to the common people and a nightmare to the elite. He was famous for his scandals, like the time he dressed as a woman to sneak into an all-female religious ceremony at Caesar's house, just for the drama. Fulvia wasn't some silent partner in this. She was right there in the trenches with him, engaging with his supporters and running their home like a political war room. They were the original power couple, bold, aggressive, and totally unapologetic. But this lifestyle was dangerous. In 52 BCE, Clodius was murdered on the Appian Way by a rival's bodyguards. It sent shockwaves through the city. But if anyone expected Fulvia to just sit at home and mourn quietly, they were dead wrong. She turned his funeral into a political event that historians are still talking about today. She paraded Clodius's mutilated body right through the Roman Forum, making sure his bloody wounds were fully exposed for maximum effect. The crowd was absolutely horrified, and then they got angry. Riots broke out, and things got so intense that the Senate house itself was burned to the ground. Fulvia had successfully turned her personal grief into a massive public uprising. This was her first big political move, and it worked perfectly. Her talent for manipulating public emotion and using spectacle as a weapon showed everyone that she was a new kind of player in Rome. Clodius was dead, but Fulvia had officially stepped out of the shadows, and she didn't waste any time mourning either. In Rome, political influence had a short shelf life, and she knew it. Shortly after Clodius died, she jumped into her second marriage, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio. He was a rising star and one of Julius Caesar's biggest fans. On the surface, they seemed like an odd match because Curio loved drama and had a bit of a flamboyant reputation, but underneath all that, he was a sharp operator. Fulvia saw Curio as a bridge to the next power block. This wasn't some romantic rebound, it was a calculated move. She needed a new political anchor to keep her first husband's populist movement alive, and Curio had Caesar's backing. Through him, she stayed right in the middle of Rome's power struggles. She even made sure Clodius's old supporters stayed active, rebranding their cause under Curio's name. But the Roman world was falling apart fast. The tension between Caesar and Pompey finally exploded into civil war. Curio went all in for Caesar, and Fulvia was right there helping him organize support and manage resources. In 49 BCE, Curio led an army to Africa to secure Caesar's position, but it was a total disaster. He was ambushed and killed, and his entire army was wiped out. For the second time, Fulvia was a widow, and once again Rome waited to see if she would finally just fade away. Spoiler, she didn't. If anything, losing 2 husbands to Rome's civil unrest only made her more resilient and more dangerous. She was far from finished. In fact, her most audacious partnership and her most dramatic chapter were still to come. Her third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and Caesar's right-hand man. Their union, around 47 BCE, wasn't just a wedding, it was a merger of power. Fulvia had already proven she was a master of Roman street politics. Antony, who was rising fast through the military and political ranks, desperately needed that kind of savvy support back in Rome. Together they became one of the most powerful couples the Republic had ever seen. By the time they got married, Fulvia was a veteran of blood and betrayal. She'd already buried 2 husbands and outplayed countless enemies. Antony was no stranger to drama either. He drank, he gambled, and his personal life was a total mess. But with Fulvia, he found someone who could do way more than just entertain him. She defended his interests, held his alliances together, and rallied his supporters whenever he was away on campaign. And Antony, despite his tough guy exterior, knew exactly how valuable she was. He let her exercise authority that no Roman woman had ever publicly touched. She opened his mail, issued orders in his name, and even sat in on high-level meetings. Of course, the Roman sources, who mostly hated her, described her as power-hungry and overbearing. But what really bothered them wasn't just her ambition. It was the fact that she acted like a Roman man in a world that didn't know how to handle a woman like her. After Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, everything went back into chaos. While Antony was busy forming the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia was the one holding down the fort in Rome. She managed his networks, coordinated with street gangs, and made sure his supporters stayed loyal. She even helped seal Antony's alliance with Octavian by marrying her daughter, Clodia, off to him, though that eventually blew up. In public, she wasn't just Antony's wife, she was his proxy. They even minted coins with Antony's face and her name on them. She wasn't hiding in the shadows of power, she was standing right in the spotlight. But power in Rome was always on borrowed time, and Fulvia was about to find out exactly how far a woman could go before the city snapped back. While Antony was off chasing military glory, Fulvia was the one controlling the streets. She was basically his regent. In a time where violence and bribery were the only ways to keep order, she proved she could play the game just as well as, if not better than, any man in the Senate. Ancient writers like Appian and Cassius Dio loved to paint her as manipulative and warmongering, but if you look past the drama, you see a woman actively doing politics in a world where women were only supposed to be busy weaving wool or mourning their husbands. Fulvia was basically operating on a level that was usually reserved for senators and consuls. She was building coalitions, backing military commanders, and even issuing official decrees. She also made it a point to be seen in public, keeping her relationships strong with the veteran soldiers, which, in the late Republic, was the group that actually held the power. While Antony was away campaigning in the East, Fulvia was the face of his authority back in Italy. She met with centurions and influenced land distribution deals, constantly reminding the troops that being loyal to Antony was going to pay off big time. But all this power made the Roman aristocrats, especially Octavian's camp, completely lose their minds. They saw her as this meddling woman with way too much influence over the legions. A woman acting without a male guardian wasn't just weird to them. It was a total threat to their world order. Fulvia wasn't stupid. She saw the cracks in the alliance between Antony and Octavian, and she realized something they hadn't yet. Rome wasn't big enough for both of them. So she decided to stop playing diplomat and start playing for keeps. In 41 BCE, she did the unthinkable. She went to war against Octavian, the man who would eventually become Augustus. And she didn't do it quietly. With Antony still in the east, Fulvia and Antony's younger brother Lucius challenged Octavian's authority in Italy. On paper, it was about defending Antony's interests and protecting veteran land rights, but make no mistake, Fulvia's fingerprints were all over this. This was a full-on military rebellion led by a woman. It was the first and only time in Roman history a woman organized a civil war. This mess, known as the Perusine War, was sparked by Octavian's controversial land program. Fulvia jumped on the public's anger, painting Octavian as a tyrant. While Lucius was her front man in the Senate, Fulvia was the one doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes. They raised 8 legions and seized the city of Perusia. Ancient sources say she was way more into the fight than Lucius was. She was rallying troops, stirring up the public, and even giving orders to generals. Octavian acted fast, though. He besieged the city through the winter, cutting off their supplies until they were forced to surrender in early 40 BCE. Lucius was spared to avoid a total fallout with Antony, but Fulvia was exiled. The woman who had once run the streets of Rome was now considered too dangerous to stay on Roman soil. She was sent to Sicyon, Greece, hoping Antony would come for her. But Antony didn't come running. Their power couple dynamic had rotted away through the war and the distance. She had fought in his name, but maybe without his okay. She had dared to wage a civil war, and now she was paying the ultimate price. Sitting in Sicyon, she realized she had risked everything for a man who wasn't even there. Fulvia had put everything on the line. Her status, her alliances, her entire life. But Antony? He didn't exactly rush to her side. In fact, by the time she landed in Greece, he was already distracted by Cleopatra in Egypt. Talk about a crushing blow. While Fulvia was out there raising legions for him, Antony was raising goblets at banquets with a queen. This wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a political slap in the face. She had fought a literal war to protect his power, and he just left her out to dry. Some historians say Antony was furious that she started the Perusine War without his okay, while others think he was actually relieved she failed. Her downfall basically cleared the way for him to make peace with Octavian, something Fulvia would have never let happen. She still had some support from the troops who were fiercely loyal to her, but her body just gave out. After surviving a siege, exile, and the heartbreak of betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BCE. She was only about 43. Whether it was illness, stress, or just a broken heart, she was gone. Her death was actually a perfect political exit for Antony. Right after she died, he met with Octavian and agreed to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia, to seal a new peace treaty. The big power players were united again, but only because the one woman bold enough to get in their way was out of the picture. History usually overshadows Fulvia with Cleopatra, but make no mistake, Fulvia was the prototype. She didn't play games from behind a curtain. She marched right into the middle of the chaos and commanded armies in a world that treated women like furniture. Rome didn't know how to handle her, so it tried to erase her. As soon as she was gone, the men she'd outmaneuvered, Antony and Octavian included, started rewriting her story. Since she couldn't defend herself, she became the perfect scapegoat. Ancient writers, mostly men with their own agendas, blamed her for the entire Perusine War, the fallout between the leaders, and basically every problem in the Republic. They painted her as this jealous, power-hungry woman who dragged men into conflicts they didn't want. But you have to wonder, were those accusations even remotely fair? Hardly. Fulvia was just operating in a political world where violence and manipulation were the name of the game. At least, if you were a man. She wasn't any more ambitious than Caesar, any more aggressive than Pompey, and she was way less ruthless than Octavian would eventually turn out to be. Her only crime was being a woman who acted like a Roman man, and Rome just couldn't digest that. She wasn't sitting at home weaving wool or acting like a political ornament. She was writing to generals, organizing mobs, and commanding the loyalty of troops. That made her dangerous, not just to Octavian, but to history itself. Even Mark Antony, the guy whose legacy she fought so hard to save, conveniently blamed her for all the civil trouble. After he made peace with Octavian and married his sister, he used Fulvia's death as a way to scrub his record clean. Her memory became the price of his political survival. No monuments, no grand funeral, no speeches in the Senate, just silence. But her enemies couldn't erase her completely. Fulvia had done too much. She'd raised armies, steered elections, and fought a civil war. She was the first Roman woman to have her name on a coin as a political player, not a metaphor. The damage to her reputation was a choice, but so was her presence in the record. Despite every attempt to bury her, she refused to vanish. Her defiance still echoes. You just have to listen past the men. If she'd been born a man, we might be calling her a second Caesar today. Instead, she was cast as the wicked woman who wanted too much. Still, she paved the way for later women like Livia or Agrippina, who would eventually control emperors and lead armies. Fulvia did it first, without any royal title to protect her. Today, we're finally seeing her for what she was, a force, not a footnote. A woman centuries ahead of her time. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a country caught between two worlds. One was stuck in centuries of oppression, and the other was dying to breathe free. In the Deep South, segregation wasn't just a habit, it was the law. Black Americans were banned from restaurants, schools, buses, and even drinking fountains. Police brutality was everywhere. Lynching was still happening, and in places like Birmingham, peaceful protesters were being met with attack dogs and high-pressure fire hoses. But change was coming, and it wasn't asking for permission. In just a few years, the civil rights movement had slammed into the national spotlight. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts were the new headlines. The tension was building to a breaking point. Names like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis weren't just names anymore. They had become symbols of pure defiance. The March on Washington didn't just happen because of one lucky conversation. It was the result of years of rising frustration and fierce hope. Black Americans were done with waiting. They were demanding their civil rights, and they were determined to make sure their voices were heard exactly where it mattered most, the nation's capital. Actually, the idea of a massive march in D.C. had been floating around for decades. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer, had originally come up with the concept way back in the 1940s to pressure the Roosevelt administration. That protest ended up being called off after Roosevelt gave in and signed an executive order. But by 1963, the stakes were way higher. Randolph, along with other leaders like Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., brought the vision back to life. This time it wasn't just about jobs. They were marching for dignity, voting rights, desegregated schools, and the basic human right to live without fear. Even though the different civil rights organizations had their fair share of disagreements, they knew they had to show a unified front. The countdown was on. Buses were being booked. Flyers were everywhere, and word of mouth was moving faster than the newspapers. The dream was literally taking shape, one footstep at a time. Now, pulling off a protest in D.C. is never easy. But planning one for over 100,000 people, that sounded like total madness. The logistics were a nightmare. Food, water, sound systems, bathrooms, medical teams, permits, you name it. The guy at the center of all this controlled chaos was Bayard Rustin. Even though he was often kept in the background because he was openly gay, which was a huge political risk at the time, he was a master strategist. Rustin had actually studied nonviolence with Gandhi's followers in India. He'd been jailed, beaten, and watched by the FBI, but nothing rattled him. He saw the March on Washington as a chance to show the world what disciplined, non-violent protest looked like when it was run with military precision. In just 8 weeks, Rustin and his team made it happen. They officially called it the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That name was a very deliberate choice. It wasn't just about racial justice. It was about economic opportunity, too. While Dr. King would become the spiritual heart of that day, it was Randolph and Rustin who made sure the demands were just as much about unemployment and workers' rights as they were about civil rights. Meanwhile, the tension beneath the surface was real. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were nervous, seriously nervous. They were terrified of riots, backlash, or even bloodshed. Even though civil rights leaders promised the protest would be peaceful, the National Guard was on standby, hospitals were on high alert, and they even banned liquor sales for the day. Federal workers were basically told to just stay home, and then there was the internal drama. The Big Six civil rights organizations, like the NAACP, SNCC, and the Urban League, didn't always see eye to eye. Some were pushing for radical action, while others wanted a more diplomatic approach. The young firebrands in the SNCC were getting impatient with Dr. King's nonviolent vibe, but in the end, they all agreed on one thing. The time for silence was over. Bayard Rustin's plan was like a military operation. Every bus and train was tracked, every speaker was timed to the minute, and marshals were trained to handle the crowd. They weren't just planning a march, they were orchestrating a moment that would shake the nation's conscience. August 28, 1963, was a sweltering Wednesday in D.C. The humidity was so thick it felt like a second shirt, but it didn't stop anyone. From every corner of the country, they showed up. Black, white, young, old, students, factory workers, and A-list celebrities like Marlon Brando and Bob Dylan. In total, over 250,000 people converged on the National Mall like a rising tide of hope. And despite all the government's fears, there was no chaos. The scene was incredibly calm. Volunteers handed out water, gospel choirs sang near the reflecting pool, and the air was filled with chants of jobs and freedom. For many Black Americans, just standing there in front of the Lincoln Memorial felt like a quiet revolution, to finally be seen and counted in front of the great emancipator himself. At noon, the program kicked off. Leaders from all different backgrounds took the stage to demand equal pay, desegregated schools, and an end to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang, and Marian Anderson, who had once been banned from singing at Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang for thousands under the open sky. As the hours went by, the crowd got quiet. Not because they were tired, but because of the anticipation. They knew what was coming. By mid-afternoon, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. walked up to the podium. He looked calm, but you could tell there was a fire building inside him. He had his prepared remarks with him, typed up and polished by his advisors the night before. But the world wouldn't end up remembering what was on those pages. They'd remember what came straight from his heart. Dr. King started with a measured intensity, laying out the grim reality of segregation, the police violence, and all the broken promises. Referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, he said, 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. His voice moved like a sermon, using rhythm and silence to pull everyone in. The crowd was locked in. People were nodding, crying, and holding up signs that just said, "Now." But then something happened that changed everything. Standing right behind King was the gospel legend Mahalia Jackson. She suddenly called out to him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And King did just that. He set his notes aside, gripped the podium, and went off script. "I have a dream," he said, and you could feel the entire crowd lean in. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Every phrase started coming out louder, and more resolute. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It wasn't just a speech anymore. It was a vision, a prayer, a literal lightning bolt through history. By the time he finished with free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last, the crowd just erupted. They knew they hadn't just heard a politician speak, they had heard prophecy. The real power of that day wasn't just the music or the famous words. It was the people. The sheer scale of humanity was overwhelming. They came from Mississippi, Michigan, California, and everywhere in between. You had seasoned activists standing next to people who had never even left their hometowns before this trip. These were ordinary people, teachers, maids, steelworkers, who didn't see themselves as political figures. They were witnesses. There were so many kids there, too, with ribbons in their hair or holding hand-drawn signs. Parents were hoisting toddlers onto their shoulders just so they could say they saw the Lincoln Memorial and heard those voices. To them, this wasn't just a day in D.C. It felt like the birth of a brand new world. Some faces in that crowd really stood out. You had a young John Lewis, only 23 years old, representing the SNCC. His original speech was so fiery and uncompromising that the senior leaders actually begged him to tone it down just minutes before he stepped on stage. He agreed, but only barely, and his call for radical change still shook everyone who heard it. And then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman who got to speak that day. But even then, she wasn't speaking for herself. She was reading a prepared statement for other women in the movement. The organizers had been taking a lot of heat for sidelining female voices, and Bates's brief but powerful moment really highlighted a harsh truth. Even in a movement about equality, some people still had to fight just to be heard. You also had this incredible mix of union organizers, rabbis, nuns, and students from every possible background. They didn't all agree on the best strategy. Some were all in on King's nonviolence, while others leaned toward Malcolm X's more militant style. But for that one day, those differences didn't matter. Unity actually won. It was like a visual symphony of what America could be. Black and white hands linked together, Freedom Now buttons pinned to shirts, and 250,000 people breathing as one. But behind the scenes, it was anything but simple. What looked like a perfectly synchronized event was actually held together with string, sweat, and a ton of last-minute compromises. Bayard Rustin, the guy who architected the whole thing, wasn't just battling logistics. He was battling politics. He was under constant scrutiny because he was openly gay, and some leaders were terrified his identity would be used to trash the whole movement. In fact, the threat of scandal haunted every stage of the planning. And we can't ignore the issue of women's voices. Even though women like Ella Baker and Dorothy Height were the backbone of the movement, none of them were invited to give a major speech. Even Rosa Parks, who everyone revered, wasn't given the microphone. It's a reminder that the movement still had its own hierarchies and blind spots. Even the Big Six organizations were feeling the friction. The younger leaders in the SNCC were getting fed up with the slow pace of change and the moderation of the older generation. They wanted to hit systemic racism harder. But for that one day, they decided unity was too important to break. Meanwhile, the FBI was watching with clenched teeth. J. Edgar Hoover had over 100 agents spying on the organizers, bugging their hotel rooms and following them everywhere. They were waiting for one slip-up to bring the whole thing down. The authorities were convinced the march would turn violent, or that communists would somehow hijack the whole thing. When none of that actually happened, they didn't back off. They just doubled down on their surveillance, especially on Dr. King. And let's not forget the money. The march cost over $250,000, which is like millions today. Most of it came from unions and donors, but organizers were scrambling until the very last second. They even had to borrow walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts just to stay in touch. It's a reminder that the March on Washington was historic, yes, but it was also deeply human, imperfect, messy, political, and very much unfinished. As the sun began to dip behind the Washington Monument, the crowd slowly started to head home. People were hugging, crying, and singing, just trying to hold on to that sacred feeling as long as they could. But the march was over. The speeches were done, and the signs were lowered. The big question hanging in that humid August air was, what happens next? At first, the media was cautiously positive. Major newspapers called it orderly and dignified, which was basically their way of saying, thank God nobody rioted. Not many outlets talked about the specific demands, like the call for a federal jobs program or a $2 minimum wage, which would be about $20 today. But everyone covered Dr. King's speech. That was impossible to ignore. President Kennedy, who had actually been against the march at first, watched it on TV with a mix of admiration and surprise. He met with the leaders at the White House right after, but legally, things were still moving at a snail's pace. His Civil Rights Act was totally stalled in Congress because of Southern opposition. For some activists, it was frustrating. They wanted immediate action, but instead it was back to the grind, organizing, resisting, and mourning. And man, that reality hit hard just a few weeks later. On September 15, 1963, 4 young black girls were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham. The dream had been voiced, but the nightmare was far from over. Still, something had changed. The march proved that mass protest could be disciplined, powerful, and impossible to ignore. It built a coalition broader than anything we'd seen before. It gave the movement a voice and a dream that would echo across the world. In the end, it created the momentum needed for the big wins. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, outlawing segregation in public places. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed, hitting the very heart of Jim Crow. Would these have passed without the march? Maybe. But they wouldn't have had that same moral force or public pressure. For Dr. King, that day made him a global icon. But that fame came with a massive price, more surveillance, more threats, and eventually his assassination in 1968. The dream he spoke about became even more tragic and revered as time went on. For the rest of the world, the march became the ultimate blueprint for what people can achieve when they finally decide to stand together. Anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and future human rights leaders all over the world would eventually look at the March on Washington as the ultimate blueprint. But its legacy isn't just a history lesson. The idea of jobs and freedom, the image of peaceful resistance, and the echoes of "I have a dream" still pulse through every modern protest. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter, you can still feel 1963 in every chant and every cardboard sign in D.C. King's Memorial now stands right across the tidal basin from Lincoln. Visitors walk past his towering image carved in stone, with those famous words etched into the granite. But the real memorial isn't made of stone. It's in classrooms, voting booths, and every voice that refuses to stay silent. That dream wasn't meant to sit in a history book. It was meant to be lived. It's been over 60 years since those 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder. The March on Washington is immortalized now. It's in every textbook and documentary. But for a lot of people, the big question is still there. Has the dream actually been realized, or just delayed? In some ways, the progress is undeniable. The legal walls of segregation were torn down. Voting rights, even if they're under pressure today, were won through literal blood and court battles. The idea of black lawmakers, judges, or a 2-term black president was unthinkable in 1963. These aren't small wins. They're huge victories won through relentless struggle. And yet those original demands of the march, the ones that often get overshadowed by the speech, are still unresolved. The call for a living wage? Still unmet. Racial disparities in housing, healthcare, and education are still deeply entrenched. Police brutality, the very thing that sparked the movement, is still igniting protests today. The dream of true economic justice, where your opportunities aren't decided by your zip code or your skin color, is still a long way off. Modern movements have taken up the mantle, using the 1963 march as both inspiration and a reminder of how much work is left. They march in the same cities and demand the same basic human rights, just in a world now shaped by social media and new forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never supposed to be the end of the story. It was a flashpoint, a stake in the ground that said, "This is who we are, and this is what we demand." It was a declaration, not a resolution, so the dream stays alive, battered and challenged, but alive. Whether it's deferred or one day fulfilled doesn't depend on the past, it depends on us. It's about the choices we make and the courage we find to keep marching until that dream actually becomes our reality.